So if we believe that hiring great people is one of the most important things we do as managers, then interviewing has to be one of the most important skills any manager can have, right? I don't think that's a controversial statement. And yet, how many of us are actually trained to be good interviewers? I mean, I know I spent 15 plus years as a business executive before receiving any formal training. And I'm sure the same is true for most of you. So let's start by looking at the stakes. Most people don't talk about candidate experience, but it's extremely important. The interview process is the first chance the person has to interact with your organization. What are they walking away with? Whether they get the job or not, they should leave the process feeling respected, heard, and like they had a sincere chance at the role. I've interviewed a bunch of times and had the company really treat me disrespectfully, and I'll never consider them again. Poor process can dramatically extend the time to hire. Slow response times, overly extended interviews, and not being on top of new applicants can add up to weeks or months where roles go unfilled. And if you don't have a great process, you probably also don't have a great handle on what you're looking to evaluate and how. This leads to a lot of poor job satisfaction and attrition on the back end. And lastly, most interview processes leave a lot of room for bias, whether intentional or not. And most bias is not intentional. But people end up hiring candidates who speak well, who they like, who say things the interviewer wants to hear. And again, that's usually not intentional. It's just human nature. So let's talk about how to fix this. And it starts with having a plan. And I mean a real plan, not just a structure. So let me explain. A plan, to me, answers four things. So first is, what are we assessing and why? The second is, how are we assessing these things? The third is, who will be involved? And the fourth is, how will we make a decision? Now, in this presentation, we're going to focus on what we're asking and how we're evaluating, because who's involved and what the process is like is going to be different for every organization. So we're going to focus on those two here because they should be the same for anyone. So traditional interviewers ask a lot of, how would you handle this type of situation? Or ask candidates to tell them about experiences on their resume. What's much more effective is to determine what are the most important traits and abilities you are trying to evaluate, and have a candidate tell you how they have handled those situations in the past, which draw on those elements. So what people have actually done and how they describe what they've actually done and thought about those things is much more likely to predict how they'll handle a similar event in the future. After all, if you ask me how I might do something, I can literally say whatever I think you want to hear. Whereas if you ask me how I have done something, and then you start asking me follow-up questions about it, you're going to be able to tell very quickly if I'm being honest or if I've really done what I've said I've done. So this process is called behavioral interviewing, and we'll get to an example shortly. But it leads to another key issue, and that is, what is a good answer to a behavioral interview question, or really any interview question? And like I said, the next slide will include an example that we can dig into further, but at a high level, what you need to do is create a scoring rubric. And this scoring rubric, which is a very funny word, defines the expectations that you have for the responses. And of course, they should be calibrated to the role and the level within the organization, because expectations for a school superintendent are going to be very different than those for a part-time after-school assistant, even though they may be asked the same exact question in an interview. So let's get to that example. So this is a real example from one of the schools Radar Talent Solutions is partnered with. The role is for a part-time after-school worker. And then before we sent any candidates to the school, we worked with them to define the traits and characteristics that they felt were most important to their organization. And then we created questions tailored around those. In this case, we were looking to evaluate inclusivity, which we defined with the school as contributes to a safe and welcoming environment by using awareness of and respect for differences in abilities, backgrounds, and perspectives. So then the school then asks each candidate to describe a situation where they had to work with someone who had different background, perspective, or ability. And how did they leverage their awareness and respect for these differences to create a safe and welcoming environment? And to me, this is a very straightforward question that people can answer from either professional experiences, their personal life, sports, or clubs they were with. And then during the discussion with the candidate, they're using the scoring rubric that's below here to make sure that they capture the data and can evaluate their responses. And in the end, the candidate is rated as meeting, exceeding, or not meeting expectations for this specific role. So each interview is usually comprised of 4 to 5 of these questions. It could be many more depending on the circumstances, but for these roles, it's 4 to 5. And the composite score determines if the candidate met the overall expectations. This process significantly reduces risk of bias by leveling the playing field for everyone and taking most of the judgment out of the hands of the interviewer. I mean, yes, the interviewer still has to decide if their example was relevant, but that's a lot better situation than them just deciding at a very high level if they like the candidate or thought they spoke well. The truth is, I could talk about this topic for much longer, but I hear the orchestra is starting to play me off, so I'll wrap it up. I hope you can see how using behavioral interviewing techniques can improve hiring and retention success, while also improving the opportunity to build a diverse workforce by reducing bias in evaluation.